In 1942, a single Japanese pilot flew across the Pacific, dropped bombs on the United States, and 20 years later, returned to apologize with a samurai sword. The sound of rain was relentless, a thin, steady hiss on the deck of the Japanese submarine I-25 as it sliced through the dark Pacific waters. The night was moonless, the air heavy with salt and anticipation. Inside the steel belly of the vessel, a young naval aviator named Nobuo Fujita sat in silence, his eyes fixed on a small photograph of his wife and infant daughter. The picture trembled slightly with the vibration of the engines. Fujita was only 30 years old, yet his face already carried the hard lines of a man who had seen too much. The year was 1942, and Japan was still riding the wave of its early victories in the Pacific. Pearl Harbor had been a devastating success, and Tokyo's leaders were determined to strike another psychological blow, one that would reach across the ocean to the very heart of the United States. The mission was simple in words, but audacious in execution: to bomb the American mainland. No nation had dared attack the continental U.S. since the War of 1812. If successful, this operation would prove that Japan could reach across the vast Pacific and strike directly at American soil. It would show the world and the American people that nowhere was safe. But Fujita knew the truth. This was no ordinary mission. It was experimental, almost suicidal. He and his observer, Petty Officer Shoji Okuda, were to fly a tiny Yokosuka E-14Y, Glenn, a two-seater reconnaissance seaplane, launched from the deck of their submarine. It was made of light metal and canvas, fragile, slow, and with barely enough room for fuel and two small incendiary bombs. Still, when the captain of I-25 summoned Fujita to the control room, the young pilot stood tall and saluted sharply. "Fujita," the captain said, his voice calm but resolute, "you are about to make history for the Emperor." "Yes, sir," Fujita replied, "for the Emperor and for Japan." Hours later, as dawn approached, the I-25 surfaced 50 kilometers off the coast of Oregon. The waves slapped cold and angry against the hull, but the sea was calm enough for launch. The crew scrambled to assemble the aircraft, its folded wings creaking open like the limbs of some mechanical bird. The deck was slick with rain as Fujita climbed into the cockpit. Okuda followed, strapping himself in behind. Their mission: to drop two 76-kilogram incendiary bombs deep in the forest near Brookings, Oregon, and ignite massive wildfires that would spread fear across the western coast. The submarine's engines rumbled below. A final handshake from the captain, and then, "Launch!" The catapult roared. The small plane shot forward into the dawn mist, skimming the ocean's surface before lifting slowly, trembling, into the gray sky. Behind them, the submarine vanished beneath the waves like a ghost. As they climbed to 4,000 feet, Fujita looked eastward. Below him stretched the endless Pacific, and ahead, a jagged coastline cloaked in fog. It was America, the enemy's homeland. For a moment, the enormity of it hit him. He, a son of Japan, was about to drop bombs on the United States itself. He had trained for war, but this felt different. There were no battleships or military bases below, only mountains, trees, and people who likely had no idea the war had come to their doorstep. Okuda leaned forward in the cockpit, shouting over the engine noise, "Target ahead! Dense forest!" Fujita nodded, pulling the release lever. The first bomb fell away, whistling into the mist below. Seconds later, the second followed. He banked the plane sharply to the west, craning his neck to look down. Two dull flashes lit up the clouds beneath them, followed by faint columns of smoke rising through the rain. No explosion, no blaze, just smoke, and then silence. The Pacific weather had betrayed them. Heavy rain dampened the forest floor, and the bombs failed to start any major fire. The entire attack had lasted barely 15 minutes. Fujita exhaled slowly, his gloved hands trembling slightly on the controls. The mission had been carried out, but not as planned. He turned the plane back toward the sea, whispering under his breath, "Let's go home, Okuda." Below, on the ground, a forest ranger named Howard Raz Angel was the first to spot the smoke. He assumed it was a small lightning fire until he stumbled upon a crater and fragments marked with Japanese characters. The United States had just been bombed. It was the first and only time in history that an enemy aircraft dropped bombs on the American mainland. Yet the government downplayed the incident, fearing public panic. Newspapers barely mentioned it. The story faded into obscurity, buried under the avalanche of larger battles raging across the Pacific. Back aboard I-25, Fujita landed safely on the dark ocean. The plane recovered and disassembled by his crewmates in tense silence. As the submarine slipped once again beneath the waves, he stared through the periscope one last time toward the distant coast of Oregon, barely visible, fading into fog. He had done his duty, but the sense of triumph he had expected never came. Instead, there was only a hollow ache, a feeling that he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. When they returned to Japan, the mission was officially declared a success, though privately everyone knew it had failed to achieve its intended purpose. There had been no great firestorm, no panic, just two small craters in a forest few Americans had ever heard of. Still, the military honored Fujita with quiet ceremony, photographs taken for propaganda, medals pinned with stiff smiles. But as he bowed before his superiors, Fujita felt none of the pride he once imagined. He thought of the quiet forests of Oregon, the unseen people who might have been living nearby, the innocent land he had tried to set ablaze. And somewhere deep inside him, beneath layers of duty and loyalty, the first seed of regret began to grow. The war ended not with a final victory cry, but with silence. In 1945, when the Emperor's voice echoed across the radio, soft, trembling, admitting defeat, Nobuo Fujita stood frozen in his small home in Ibaraki. The once proud naval aviator felt as though the world had stopped spinning. Outside, Japan lay in ruins, cities flattened, children wandering streets of ash, men like him stripped of rank, of purpose, of identity. For years, Fujita had served his emperor with total devotion. He had flown reconnaissance over enemy waters, carried out the bombing of Oregon, and believed, as millions of others did, that his sacrifice was noble. But now the empire he had fought for no longer existed. The rising sun had set. Fujita's uniform was gone, replaced by a worn work shirt. He opened a small hardware shop to feed his family, repairing farming tools for neighbors who were too poor to buy new ones. Each morning, he swept the front step of his store in silence. Children ran past him, laughing, unaware of who he once was. Sometimes, as he heard the faint hum of aircraft high above, he would look up, not in pride, but in memory. He rarely spoke of the war. Even to his wife, he said little. There were no medals on his walls, no photos of his plane. He carried those memories quietly, like a shadow he could never escape. When asked about the bombing mission years later, he would only say, "It was my duty, but I wish it had never been necessary." In post-war Japan, talk of the war was taboo, and talk of those who had attacked America, even more so. Fujita's mission was unknown to most of his countrymen. He was not celebrated, nor was he condemned. He simply vanished into the tide of forgotten soldiers, yet deep down he could not forget. Sometimes at night, when the cicadas fell silent, Fujita dreamed of Oregon. He saw the endless forest, wet with rain. He saw the bombs fall, the thin trails of smoke rising into the mist, and he saw faces, American faces, people he never knew but somehow could not stop imagining. In 1950, an American magazine ran a small article about the Japanese pilot who bombed Oregon. It mentioned his name briefly, noting that the attack had caused little damage. Fujita came across a translated clipping years later. He read it 3 times. He felt no anger that they called him a failed raider. In fact, there was relief in knowing that no one had died. He had once thought of that mission as a moment of glory. Now, he saw it for what it truly was, a strange, desperate act of war that served no purpose except to remind him of how easily men could be led by pride and fear. By the 1960s, Fujita was a quiet, middle-aged man with silver at his temples and calloused hands from years of labor. His shop was modest, his customers loyal. Few would ever guess that he had once bombed the United States. He often sat on a wooden stool behind his counter, listening to the distant chatter of schoolchildren outside. They spoke of America, not as an enemy, but as a place of cars, movies, and opportunity. The thought made him smile. The world, it seemed, had moved on, but he hadn't. The guilt still clung to him, not for killing, because he hadn't, but for trying to, for crossing an invisible moral boundary that no apology could undo. Then, one day, in the spring of 1962, a letter arrived. It came in a plain envelope, addressed in English but translated by a friend. The sender, Brookings, Oregon, the very town he had once tried to set ablaze. The letter began politely. Dear Mr. Fujita, we are students from Brookings Harbor High School. We have been studying the history of World War II and learned that you were the pilot who dropped bombs near our town in 1942. We would like to invite you to visit Brookings, not as an enemy, but as our guest. Fujita read the letter twice, then set it down. His hands trembled. Was this real? Americans inviting him to their town? For several nights, he could not sleep. He pictured himself stepping off a plane in Oregon, facing the people he had once tried to harm. What if they hated him? What if they wanted revenge? He even joked with his daughter, perhaps they will hang me. But behind the joke was a quiet fear. Still, something within him stirred, something that had been dormant since the war. A chance, perhaps, to face what he had done, to find peace at last. After long hesitation, Fujita wrote back. He would come, and he would bring a gift, a symbol of his apology and honor, the samurai sword that had been in his family for 400 years, passed down through generations of warriors. He planned to present it to the people of Brookings, not as a trophy, but as a gesture of reconciliation, a bridge across 2 decades of silence. As he polished the blade one final time, he caught his reflection in the steel. He no longer saw the proud young pilot of 1942. He saw a man weathered by regret, yet brave enough to face it. When his ship departed for America that summer, Nobuo Fujita stood on deck, the Pacific stretching before him once more. 20 years earlier, he had crossed this same ocean as an enemy. Now he crossed it as a man seeking forgiveness. The Pacific stretched endlessly before him once again, but this time it was quiet. The wind smelled of salt and memory as Nobuo Fujita leaned against the railing of the passenger ship bound for America. 2 decades earlier, he had crossed these same waters under orders of war, guided by vengeance and duty. Now at 60, he traveled by choice, guided only by the fragile hope of forgiveness. In his suitcase, wrapped carefully in cloth, was the samurai sword that had belonged to his family for more than 4 centuries. Its hilt was worn smooth by generations of hands, its blade still polished bright as morning light. For Fujita, it was not merely a weapon, it was his lineage, his honor, his apology. He clutched the handle gently, whispering, "If I cannot offer words enough, perhaps this will speak for me." As the ship drew closer to the American coast, Fujita's nerves tightened. He had read every line of the invitation letter dozens of times, but he still couldn't believe it. "We are not angry," one of the Brookings students had written. "We want to understand. We want to meet you." Those words had haunted him. He couldn't imagine how they could forgive a man who had once flown over their forests with death in his payload. When he arrived in Portland, reporters gathered at the terminal. Cameras flashed, and journalists jostled for position. "Is it true?" one shouted. "You're the pilot who bombed Oregon." Fujita bowed deeply before answering through his interpreter. "I was. I come now as a friend." The drive from Portland to Brookings took nearly 7 hours. The car wound along Oregon's coastal highway, cliffs and redwoods towering on one side, the endless blue Pacific on the other. It was almost ironic, he thought. This same ocean that once separated enemies now connected them. As the car descended into the small town of Brookings, Fujita felt his heartbeat quicken. American flags fluttered from storefronts. The streets were lined with curious faces, children, veterans, teachers, townsfolk. He expected coldness, maybe even hostility. Instead, he was met with applause. A small brass band played softly near the town square. The mayor stood waiting with a welcoming smile. Students from the high school, the same ones who had written to him, held hand-painted signs that read, "Welcome, Mr. Fujita," and "Peace between friends." Fujita bowed low, holding back tears. The weight of 2 decades lifted slightly from his shoulders. At the town hall ceremony, he was introduced as a man who once came here in war, but returns now in peace. Fujita took the stage slowly, the sword case in his hands. His English was limited, but his sincerity needed no translation. He began, voice trembling, 20 years ago, I flew over your beautiful forests. I carried bombs, not because I hated you, but because my country told me it was my duty. I am deeply sorry for the fear I caused. I bring with me this sword, once a weapon, now a symbol of peace and friendship." He opened the case. The blade gleamed under the fluorescent lights, centuries of history reflected in its perfect edge. A murmur rippled through the audience. Then, with both hands, Fujita offered it to the mayor of Brookings. The mayor accepted it with equal solemnity. "We will treasure this," he said softly, "as a reminder that even enemies can choose friendship." Applause filled the hall, not loud, but long and heartfelt. Later that day, Fujita was taken to see the site of his bombing. The drive led into the deep, green heart of the Oregon forest. The same forest he had once looked down upon through the fog, now alive with sunlight and birdsong. He stood quietly among the towering trees, listening to the sound of the wind. "I tried to burn this place," he said to his interpreter, "but it lives. It's beautiful." For several minutes no one spoke. Fujita removed his cap, closed his eyes, and bowed deeply to the earth. That moment, one man bowing in a silent American forest, said more than any speech could. During his week in Brookings, Fujita visited schools, met war veterans, and spoke with townspeople. Children asked curious questions about Japan, about airplanes, about what war felt like. He answered each one patiently. When one small boy asked, "Did you mean to hurt us?" Fujita smiled sadly. "No," he said, "I only meant to serve my country, but I learned that war serves no one." At night, he stayed in a modest local inn overlooking the ocean. He would sit on the balcony for hours, staring at the horizon. The same horizon he had once flown over as a soldier, now shimmered with peace. Before leaving, the town hosted a farewell dinner in his honor. The mayor toasted him as a man of courage, not for bombing us, but for coming back. Fujita stood, raising his glass of water. "In 1942, he said, "I came here to bring destruction. Today, I leave with friendship. The people of Brookings have given me a gift greater than forgiveness. You have given me peace." The room fell silent. Then applause, gentle, sustained, and genuine. When Fujita finally boarded his flight home, he looked out the window as Oregon disappeared beneath the clouds. His eyes filled with tears. He thought of the students, the townsfolk, the children who had smiled at him, none of whom had owed him kindness, yet had offered it freely. He thought of the sword, now resting safely in the Brookings Library, not as a trophy of war, but as a monument to reconciliation. And as the airplane banked toward the Pacific, he whispered softly to himself in Japanese, "Maybe this time I truly returned home." By August 1945, the once proud Imperial Japanese Army was on the brink of annihilation. Cities were burning ruins, industry crippled, and the nation's will tested beyond breaking. Yet, for men like Captain Cato and the defenders of Peleliu's spiritual brotherhood, those who still hid in the jungles of forgotten islands, surrender was unthinkable. Honor was absolute. The emperor was divine. Death was preferable to disgrace. Thousands of miles away, the United States prepared for a finale that would shock the world. President Truman had inherited a weapon of unimaginable power, the atomic bomb. While the Japanese government debated whether surrender could even be considered without violating Bushido, the first bomb fell on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. Within seconds, a city of 350,000 people became a living inferno. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The world held its breath. Emperor Hirohito, once distant and silent, made the unprecedented decision to speak directly to his people. His voice, trembling yet calm, was transmitted across the nation, the first time most Japanese had ever heard him. "Endure the unendurable," he said. For millions, it was both liberation and heartbreak. The war was over, but not for everyone. In scattered jungles across the Pacific, from Guam to the Philippines, from New Guinea to tiny atolls, isolated Japanese soldiers refused to believe the emperor had surrendered. They assumed it was Allied propaganda. They stayed hidden, surviving on coconuts and rats, patching uniforms, maintaining discipline, waiting for orders that would never come. Among them was a young intelligence officer named Hiru Onoda, stationed on Lubang Island in the Philippines. When the war ended, he refused to accept it. For nearly 30 years, he waged a one-man campaign, ambushing patrols, sabotaging farms, and living like a ghost. Leaflets, newspapers, even messages from his family were dismissed as enemy tricks. It wasn't until 1974 that his former commanding officer, now a bookseller, was brought to the island to deliver the official order to stand down. Onoda, gaunt and still wearing his immaculate uniform, finally saluted, wept, and surrendered his sword. The war for him was truly over. He wasn't alone. Soldiers like Shoichi Yokoi in Guam and Teruo Nakamura in Indonesia lived hidden for decades after 1945. For them, Japan's defeat was unimaginable. They had built their entire existence around loyalty, obedience, and sacrifice. When they finally returned home, these men were greeted as symbols, relics of a lost era. Japan had transformed into a new nation, one built not on conquest, but on resilience, peace, and technology. The old Japan, the one of rising suns and eternal emperors, had vanished. Captain Kado's spirit, in a way, lived on through them, men who refused to surrender their duty, even when the empire that birthed it had crumbled to dust. The Second World War had begun with an empire dreaming of divine destiny and ended with an atomic dawn that changed humanity forever. And in the silence that followed, amid the ashes of Tokyo, the graves of Okinawa, and the coral reefs of Peleliu, the world learned the most terrible truth of all. Victory and defeat were not opposites, but reflections of the same unending human tragedy.